So for our very last and I won't say very greatest because the other speakers matter too, but we do have a pillar of the web performance community coming up next. Tim Kadlec is a performance consultant and trainer, and he's also the author of several books and has contributed a lot of content and support for the web performance community, for which we are all very grateful. So I want everyone, please welcome Tim Kadlec.
Thanks. Thanks, Sia. Yeah, but I always get a little sad on day 2 of this event. I'm a little biased, but this is my favorite event by far. The entire year I look forward to it. The talks have been amazing, right? How incredible have all the speakers been? Yeah. Nowhere to go but down from here, am I right? But no, I look forward to the talks, but it's also the conversations. It's genuinely the conversations. That's always the standout for me. I've said it time and time again, but I feel like the performance community is an incredibly special one. The only reason I get to do what I do professionally is because, I've made a career out of asking people smarter than me. Many of the people in this room have been those people to explain things to me patiently like I'm a 5-year-old. That's how I get by doing this. We just have an incredible, patient, kind community, helpful folks, and such a good mix of people come to this event. You get people that are working on the CDNs, the browsers, the standards, people that are working at agencies, they're working on in-house stuff, they're working on external work. Just such a variety of different perspectives and opinions. And that's I think what always pushes things forward is when you get all of that mix together. So it's just a very kind and curious community. And I think that's really important. I've become a little bit obsessed with what I believe that any step forward, any big step forward in innovation has to have a combination of curiosity, improved tooling, and improved metrics. And I feel like if any one of those pieces is missing, we don't make progress. That's where we get a little bit stuck. All 3 of these have to come together. And like I said, I've been a little bit obsessed with this recipe, and it's not just for performance. I feel like this applies to any area of innovation. My parents they store a lot of things for a very long time. I guarantee you in their shed are still worksheets from when I was 5 years old. I guarantee I've seen some of them. But they were recently going through some of that, and they gave me a tub of some of the stuff that they found, that were mine for me to figure out what to do with. And one of the things they gave me when I was going through was this. This is a floppy disk. Now, for those who can't read it because the writing's a little bit, handwriting's not great, there's 2 lines here. One says Al Hoffman's adjusted stats, and above that it says Joey's adjusted MBA stats. Now, you probably have a couple questions, I think, that are necessary for this to make any sense, so we're going to answer those right away. First off, a floppy disk. It was a storage device before USB drives, way less capacity, much bigger for some reason. Nowadays, they make excellent coasters, I hear. I believe you can buy them on Etsy, actually. The second thing is, you need to know Joey. I'm Joey. My middle name is Joseph, and as a kid, my family called me Joey. Anybody who knows me as a kid, anybody who knows me from my family, they still call me Joey. It wasn't until around college, and actually when I started doing stuff online, that I started trying to use Tim for the name. And so there's a very clear divide. In fact, it was kind of funny. My wife and I were high school sweethearts, and when so all of her friends knew me as Joey, and so a couple years later, when she sent out wedding invites to her friends, they all said that she was marrying Tim, and she got so many calls from who is Tim? Is this a relative of his? What's happening here? So I'm Joey. So those are my adjusted NBA stats, NBA National Basketball Association for the non-sports folks. And so that probably brings up a third question, and the answer is that yes, I was about as cool as you would expect a kid who walked around with a floppy disk full of their own statistically adjusted comparisons of NBA basketball players would be. That was very cool. But I remember working on this, actually. You see, I have one of the things that I don't think it's a great trait necessarily, but when I get into something, I get obsessed. There's not really much of a middle road for me. I get a little freakish about it. I don't do things lightly. And so in junior high, I got really obsessed with basketball. It was playing basketball, but it was also watching basketball, and it was the history of basketball, and it was coaching. The first career ambition I had, until my guidance counselor told me it was not a viable career, was I wanted to be a basketball historian. And then he said, that doesn't work out, nobody's going to hire you, and so I switched to web stuff. Actually, the reason I learned web technology was that so I wanted to write about basketball online. And so I was obsessed with this, and shortly after our family got our first family computer with internet access, I stumbled on the Association for Professional Basketball Research. Now, the site, by the way, you can still go to it, yeah, I said that fast, but that's right, .org. It still looks like this. Doesn't look legit, but it actually was pretty, there's a lot of legit work happening from this group. This was a group of folks that were as obsessed with basketball as I was. And actually, if you go and you look down somewhere in here, my name is still cited as a contributor. Now, many of you have probably heard of the, or seen the dog comic on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. I was definitely the dog. I jumped in on this, I think I was like 12 or 13. And it was so me and like a bunch of like retired folks talking about like basketball history and basketball data. And I was just super eager. And so they had a mailing list that went through this, and I would like read every email and jump in on every conversation. I used to buy old like 1930s basketball programs, and then I would go through them and pull out the stats and then email the group. And that's why my name is the contribution thing. Yeah, I totally geeked out on this stuff. But I remember in the mailing list, Al Hoffman, the other person on that floppy disk, he started playing with there's so much variety in different playing styles and stuff over there as of basketball. So he was like, well, how do we compare? How do we figure out how somebody really stacks up historically? So he was trying to adjust career stats based on the differences in playing style and all this stuff. And I thought that was cool, of course. So I decided that I was going to have a tweak on his algorithm and kind of do my own. I still have no idea I don't remember what I changed or why I thought that I was new enough to change something, but that's what this whole thing was. But that was just one of many conversations actually about metrics. Metrics became such a dominant conversation on that group, we actually got complaints. So we had to break off and have a subgroup that was just APPR metrics with a forum and a mailing list where we just talked about analytics and all of that kind of stuff. Now, it was super hyper geeky, right? But it's not overstating it to say that some of it ended up being quite revolutionary. Not my stuff. To be very clear, nothing that I did was. But there are people in that group who ended up becoming pioneers of sports statistics. They've written books, they've went on to work for professional organizations, they head up the data analysis teams. They help them teams to focus on how to keep their players healthier, how to build teams, how to play the game. A lot of this actually turned into a really big deal. I mean, today's NBA, like pretty much every basketball or professional sport, I should say, is underlined by a very strong foundation of analytics and data. And it's been pushed on by, the tooling as well. They've seen cameras and optical tracking devices have gotten better and better and higher fidelity. The NBA spends millions a year to have these tracking devices put inside of their stadium so they can monitor every little thing. Just this year, actually, they upgraded everything. So they now have optical tracking that is tracking 29 different skeletal coordinates on every player's body. Knees, wrists, everything. Every little precise movement that they make is being cataloged. It might sound overkill to some, but it's really fascinating because if you think about it, if you're watching a game of anything, like basketball is a fast-moving sport, the coach or whoever it is watching the game, there's only so much you can take in at once, right? But, in theory at least, if we're tracking all of this stuff, we can get all sorts of this invisible stuff that's happening to be surfaced. And then you pair it with machine learning, and now you're able to get to advanced analytics and advanced data out of this stuff. So it's really fascinating to see some of the changes that have occurred of that. There's one example from a team building perspective that I wanted to give quick. It's from an excellent book called The Mid-Range Theory. If anybody just wants to geek out on data and basketball and how they intersect, it's a great book. But Seth Partnow, the author of this, writes a story about how in 2018 he was working with the Milwaukee Bucks. And they were looking to bring in a center. So that's usually the biggest guy on the team. And they were looking at a guy named Brook Lopez. Brook Lopez was a free agent. He had a reputation for being a good scorer, but a really poor defender. Now, again, for folks who are not really into sports, The goal of the game is to put the ball through the hoop. That's how you score. You want to stop the other team from doing that. Defense is really important. It's hard to win without good defense. And he had the reputation of being overpaid, slow, not very agile, kind of a dinosaur for the modern day NBA era. And none of his surface stats look good. Like if you looked at the surface stats there was nothing to suggest that he had any potential to be a better defensive player than what he had shown up as so far. However, because of all the tracking data, they had access to new metrics that didn't exist before that showed some stuff that the coaches weren't seeing on the tape. So one of those was around the defensive rebounding percentage. So when an offense is coming down the court, they take a shot. You're hoping to force them into a bad shot. Then you go up and you grab the rebound, you grab the ball, and now it's your possession. Defensive rebounding is critical for any team. It's a key cog in defense. Good. So what they looked at is when they looked at the percentage of available defensive rebounds while he was on the court, like how many potential rebounds could he get, and then what percentage of those did he get? He was in the 94th percentile in the league. He was excellent, amazing at it. When they looked at the team impact as well, when he was on the court, his team, like he was the 5th most impactful player in the league. When he was on the court, his team rebounded better. Even if he wasn't getting it, the rest of the team did better. They looked at defending the paint. So the paint is the painted area close to the basket. It's where the highest percentage shots are. They looked at how the percentage of the shooters when he was the closest defender within 5 feet. And he was in the 87th percentile on this. He was, by every underlying data point, an elite defender in the making. So they pulled the trigger. They signed him for what, by NBA purposes, is cheap. And they brought him on. And over the next 4 seasons, this poor defender went on to be all-defense first team. That means top 5 in the league. All-defense second team another year. That's top 10. Runner-up for defensive player of the year. That's top 2. And the cog in a defense that ended up winning an NBA championship. None of this is because Seth or anybody else in the front office is a genius. In fact, he says that explicitly when he's telling the story. Like it completely has nothing to do with anything that they did. What this is this was a combination of curiosity to applying that to a foundation of improved tooling and improved metrics that had been prompted by other curious individuals over decades of experimentation and decades of work. It's really easy to find the parallels to this in our own industry. Like they're all over the place. Mark mentioned largest contentful paint. I actually wanted to dive into that for just a second because I think it's a really fascinating example of how this all works together and how we get a flurry of innovation and standards that come out the other end. Come out the other end isn't the best way of phrasing that. That's smooth. Anyway, now keep in mind that this is the history as I know it. Like I feel like, I was there for some of it, seen some of it, I've read about some of it I'm sure I don't have. I think the interesting thing about like any great idea evolves over time through the input of many, and it's really, really hard to go back to its origin because I feel like it's sparked by a few but refined by a ton. And that's kind of how this goes, but this is at least a partial imperfect attempt to sort of show the progression here. So the story is, at least from my involvement, and it remembers in the early 2010s, we had these sort of unconference events, right? These were WebPerf days, things like that, where we'd get together. It was a bar camp style for anybody who's done that. You get together, you have the Post-it notes, you pick the topics you want to write about, everybody puts them up on a board, you organize them, and you're like, great, well, let's have breakout sessions on these things here. And I remember one of the common ones that we had at several of these was around, hey, all we've got is onload and document complete and stuff like, we really want can we get some rendering focused metrics? We would like paint metrics. And the specific example that was cited a few times was we would love to be able to say on an e-commerce product page, when does that hero image load? Because we had nothing like that, but we all kind of recognized that, you know what, this was really important. It's probably more important than the load metrics that we had. Now, the initial response from this wasn't great. Like, it wasn't dismissive in any way. I don't want to set it up like that, but it also wasn't encouraging. The initial response, Pat mentioned the, privacy ruins everything. Yeah, well, our initial reaction that we got from browser vendors when we talked about this wasn't realistic. It wasn't going to happen. There were too many privacy concerns in exposing anything resembling accurate paint timings. Like, you open up the door for all sorts of interesting little timing attack kind of stuff. And it was discouraging. I remember having beers with people and talking about that after the events, and being a little bummed out about it. The story probably could have died there, but the perf community has always been a very resourceful one. Around 2012, Pat, who apparently has habit of just putting up performance tools in his basement. I've got my laundry down there personally. I don't know. He had web page tests running out of his basement at the time, and he added to web page test a metric called speed index. Now, speed index was a really influential metric. It still is a really useful metric. I still know quite a few perf people who swear by it as one of their top couple that they look at. It is still a great metric to look at. But what speed index does is it looks at the progression of a page load. So instead of just focusing on the load time metrics that we had, it would look at how quickly do we get the majority of the content on the screen. And based on that, we give it a score. Lower score is better because it means we got the majority of the content up there faster. So in these two hypothetical examples, let's say that there's a fourth image off to the side where they hit load at the same time. But the progression on the top film strip, much, much nicer, right? Because we're getting the majority of the content for people to read and to consume out earlier. And so that's what speed index started to report on and let us actually get finally a little bit of a better rendering metric. I think somewhere in there we had above the fold render time and a few other little things like that, but speed index was a monumental step forward in focusing on the rendering. A few years later, 2015, this is another one that stands out to me, was Steve Sodders wrote about hero image custom metrics. So Steve started doing these experiments. We still had no way of recording when that product image shows up. So Steve started experimenting with, well, what could we do with just JavaScript, right? So we had performance.mark. So we could do things like, what he tried was he put a script, an inline script that would use a performance mark right after the image in the source code. He also used an onload event on the image itself to fire a different performance mark. So it looks something like this. And he ran a bunch of experiments just to see, comparing it to the film strip. And he found that if you looked and you took the longest of these two metrics, you got pretty close to when the image showed up on the screen. Now, again, it wasn't super, super precise, but it was a big step forward because now we had a way that had been tested across multiple browsers that we could potentially do this on our own, despite the fact that we had nothing yet from the browsers to be able to do anything standard-wise. 2017 is when we get the first working draft of the paint timing API. Now, this is the one that gives us first paint and first contentful paint. Not largest contentful paint, that's a separate thing. It's a little confusing, but that's that. The paint timing stuff is all about first paint and first contentful paint. So this is a full, at least seven years, and I'm sure there were conversations before this, between bringing this up and then, hey, we've got something now that browsers are going to be able to work on, browsers are going to be able to ship. And we're actually going to be able to get some of this paint timing that we desperately wanted and start to really move that conversation. And I don't think, you look at the 7-year gap can be a little bit whew, but if I feel like you needed those necessary steps in between. We needed the momentum that came from the experimentation from Speed Index to get to this point, to where that interest was there, and we started to find ways around some of the issues. Not even a full year, 6 months later maybe, SpeedCurve put out Last Painted Hero, which is what Mark referred to during his talk, where it recorded the hero text, hero background image, hero image, the last one to be painted onto the screen. That comes out in its tool, so now we've got another tool really starting to push and promote a hardcore rendering metric. And then not long after that, we saw largest contentful paint get the intent to ship in Chrome in 2019. And then, of course, this morning, we got it in Firefox, so that's freaking cool, huh? I'm really pumped about this. As an aside, I've had some concerns that performance is kind of on the edge of a performance monoculture. Our conversations are dominated by one browser. It's not through a fault of their own. They're actually doing great work. But we do end up talking a lot about metrics that are supported by one browser, exploring it in tooling that is run by one browser, thresholds that are set by that one browser. And so it's really, really important that we get that cross-browser focus wherever and whenever we can. So having metrics like this available in other browsers is a big, big deal. Because without them, I worry that we can stagnate a bit. I like this. This is better than the tree falls in the wood and nobody. This is a happy little dinosaur. My kids are obsessed with this game. It's so sad. It's fun. But I do wonder, I do worry that sometimes if the metrics are absent in these other browsers, do we risk just ignoring or falling behind or not adopting things that we should? And I do believe, I have a suspicion, and I could be wrong. This is suspicion. Tim could just be dumb. But I do believe that in part, one of the reasons why we tend to see Safari lag sometimes on adopting some of the newer performance standards is because we also see them lag a little bit on some of the newer performance modern metrics. And in all honesty, why ship standards that impact metrics that you can't measure in tools and that your tools don't show, like in support? So I do suspect that plays at least a little role in there, even if it's not a super hyper obvious one. And similarly, as a developer, it's really hard to put effort into using something that we can't show the impact of. Tammy mentioned that every developer should be able to show the impact of the work that they've done. Couldn't agree more. And metrics with clear targets, particularly if we do the kind of filtering and splicing and dicing that Tim was mentioning in his talk earlier, that's one of the best ways to do that. And if they don't show up, it's sometimes hard to get those things out the door. I remember when I worked at a company, we had a product that would inject resource hints. It could inject pre-connects when those first came out. And we talked to one of the customers, and we were trying to get them on board with the pre-connects because we could see, like in web page tests and stuff, the impact that it made. And we could not, they had zero interest in putting it out. And the reason why was because at the time, does anybody remember like the industry benchmarks like from Keynote and Gomez and stuff like that? Yeah. So there was like, they'd put out these things, you'd be like the top 10 retailers or whatever, all that jazz. It turned out this company, their success at the time was based on how well they did in these benchmarks. Keynote and Gomez ran browsers that were several versions old, and so they didn't support a lot of these modern standards. So injecting a pre-connect literally did nothing for them by the metrics that they were using for success. It's a good cautionary warning, I guess, in the importance of picking good tools as well. But I do think it's a massive, massive win that LCP is we now have our first cross-browser supported, at least in 2 browsers, Core Web Vital. So kudos to the Firefox team for jumping on that. Yeah, you can whistle, that's good. That's whistle-worthy, I feel like. So you can see there were many different stops along the way, a bunch of iterations on experiments, on tooling, on things that were very non-standard, just somebody rolling up their sleeves and trying something out. Honestly, we could be filling in these gaps a lot more. Somewhere in 2016, 2017, and 2018, element timing went through 3 different iterations where there was first an attempt to spec it, and then in 2017, they were like, well, the images are too hard. We're just going to focus on text. And then they kind of cracked the nut and came back in 2018 and re-expanded it now into a new one. So it ended up turning into the element timing API that Mark mentioned that I also think I would love to see everywhere, not just Chromium, please. And then somewhere in there, too, is when hero rendering times from SpeedCurve, before Last Painted Hero, the hero rendering times came out, and that was based on one of the earlier versions, too, of element timing. So you can see the tooling and the metrics in that went hand in hand and played together. And of course, so the progress wasn't fast. It wasn't, I don't think, linear. But we've seen a flurry of innovation that's come out since then, right? We've saw a couple of talks already in the last 2 days that really focused on LCP a lot, talked a lot about the different optimizations available to us. Pat mentioned, Robin, the reason why you all have to sign safety waivers for next year. Mentioned fetch priority and how that is a cheat code for LCP in particular. Absolutely is. You don't usually get a performance win that's just a single attribute like that. I know eBay put this out in November of last year and talked about how they saw an LCP improvement of 150 milliseconds in RUM data instantly. And now 150 milliseconds is nothing to sneeze at. I think it was, I don't remember who was mentioning, it's not always, Tammy was mentioning, it's not always those 500 millisecond wins. We're looking for 100 milliseconds at a time. So that's a pretty big deal for, it's not even a one-line change, it's a, attribute change. Lazy loading, having native lazy loading available in the browser is incredible. Just the sheer amounts of JavaScript that you can hear falling off of sites when they ship something like this is incredible. It's taking away megabytes of JavaScript that we don't need anymore. And it's also kind of interesting, by the way, just as an aside, both of these are also standards that were in a long time in the making. Priority hints actually had another variation that almost shipped or may have shipped and then got pulled back. I don't remember exactly what happened, but that was pretty close at one point. Lazy loading was another one of those conversations that we've been having for 10 years. And again, I actually think, though, that in retrospect, I question whether or not something like this would have had as much impact had it shipped before those metrics were around to show the evidence of actually getting them out. So it's one of those things that in the moment can feel frustrating, but sometimes in retrospect, you're like, you know what, I don't know if that would have landed, because what would we have looked at to prove its efficiency? So I'm pretty excited. I think we're at a really exciting point in the performance industry. I think we've seen a flurry of innovation around new metrics in the past few years. new tooling to support that. I feel like the attribution and stuff that Nishu was talking about has been a huge step forward. And I think all of this is going to really start to give us a better picture of what's going on. And we're going to get a flurry of new standards and innovations that are coming soon, I think. I think we're on the cusp of a important but potentially painful impact on how we build for the web. And I think a lot of the stuff that I'm most excited about has to do with the main thread and the other things that we're doing to devices. I feel a little bad about this next one. I had this before FID got beat up a little bit the last couple days, but it is a fibber. Like it has lulled us into a false sense of security in terms of what we're doing on the web and on main thread. We'll get into that in a minute. But if you look at first input delay right now on the web, it's as of September 23, it's 94% of mobile origins have good FID based on the 100 millisecond threshold. Interaction in XPaint, which has been talked about a few times now, that's 65% of mobile origins. It's a much more it's a harsh awakening a little bit, particularly since I think first input delay was so easy, I guess, to hit. We'll touch on that in a little. But I'm really, really optimistic and really encouraged about the migration to IMP. I think IMP has a chance to really start to force us to assess how we build for the web and what we do with the main thread in JavaScript. And it's just a much more accurate representation of reality. So this is the Albert site. I'm using Chrome to take a profile, just opening the menu. And this is a really common, by the way, issue. I don't know, pull up any e-com shop, expand the product menu like that on a mobile device, and this issue is going to hit maybe 60, 70% of them. It happens. So this is the resulting trace here. So there's a couple things I wanted to zero in on. First, I do have the Web Vitals extension running because it's a super handy thing for just evaluating core Web Vitals as you're playing around. And you can see it spitting out the different metrics. And it's giving me very, very different scores here. First input delay looks amazing. 11 milliseconds is blazing fast. INP is 544 milliseconds. I don't think I even throttled this, by the way. I think this is unthrottled. 544 milliseconds for the interaction to next paint metric. Such a big disparity. And it's because of the way that they report. So if we zoom in on this actually in the main thread and see what's going on, this chunk here, we've got a chunk over here where you might see under the interactions, it's starting to say pointer and it gets truncated. And then we've got this pointer chunk over here. So it actually fires two, when you open it, there's actually two related pointer events. They both have work associated with them. The total time, technically, between when I tap and when the work is done and completed is actually about a 711 milliseconds. First input delay only cares about the first input and the delay until the browser can start processing and the JavaScript related to it. So that's this little sliver there. That's what first input delay is telling us out of the 711 milliseconds. Interaction in XPaint will take the larger of the two events in this case, the longest interaction, and give me the metric for that. So that's where our 545 milliseconds comes through. Now you can see already that this is much, much nicer, right? If you're going to optimize this, where should you be focusing? It should be on this, right? And first input delay gives you no indication of what's going on. INP at least lets us start diving in. I think there's a case, I think it would be interesting to see the whole composite score at some point. But I'm not mad about it. I think 545 milliseconds compared to 11, it's already starting to shine the light where we should be focusing on improving this. So I'm really excited about that. I think Nishu gave us a bunch of reasons to be really excited and optimistic about INP and its potential impact on the web yesterday. She mentioned the new APIs like scheduler.yield is input pending. We had a talk about that, a few of us. I think it'll be interesting to see when we get to a lot of real world case studies, how hard is it to isolate and find the things that you should be putting in those, to break up those tasks, I think is going to get super interesting. Sometimes, things that sound great early on, and then we start to put them battle test them on the web, we find we got to iterate on them, and that's okay. That's all part of the process. She also mentioned the better attribution that comes with Loaf. And I love the focus on attribution from recent metrics in the past few years. That is a game changer. Just as an aside, attribution can transform real user monitoring into a full-on diagnostic tool. Real user monitoring in the past has always been, to me, much, much more useful as I need to check the state of affairs and see how we're doing in this situation or that situation. And it's super important. But if you want to troubleshoot what the heck's going on, you run out of steam really quick. Right? Attribution now makes it possible for RUM to be a full-on diagnostic tool. And I am so pumped for when we see more RUM providers start to jump on that attribution train and really push that forward. So yeah, FID is a little bit of a fibber, but I do find myself in an odd situation where I feel like I need to defend it for just 2 seconds. I think a lot of the frustration we feel towards FID and some of these other modern metrics is honestly less about the metric itself and more about the fallout of trying to use a metric for every site on the web with a threshold that applies to every site on the web. What I mean by that is like first input delay itself isn't bad when we look at what it's measuring. If we know that it's measuring just that input delay, great. That is actually sometimes a really important and useful thing for us to know. When we have an input delay there, we'd like to be able to zero in and fix it. It's just probably not a metric that's worthy of every site focusing on. And so I think that that's more of the fallout than the frustration that sometimes comes with this. But I would like to say that I do believe, and this might be slightly controversial because I know people have very different takes on this sometimes, I think imperfect data is much, much, much better than no data. If you promised it, there's the caveat. You got to think critically. You got to explore the gaps, whatever. But like, I would much, much rather have an imperfect metric than no metric at all. If we were to turn off every light in this venue, don't do that. If we were to turn off every light in this venue, and then we said, okay, all of you need to make your way outside and find your way outside, right? Now, we give you a choice. The only tool available to you is a flashlight that's running on like one dying battery, and it can only give you a little bit of light. You'd all take it, right? Because that's better than running around in the pitch black. Like, it gives you at least a little bit of visibility. You can't see everything that's going on, but at least you have some awareness of what's taking place. And I feel like that's where even imperfect data and even imperfect metrics can be a really good starting point. And to me, it makes it much, much easier to see the gaps. Like, it's much easier to see the gap when I have an imperfect data or data point or an imperfect metric in place than to anticipate where that gap might be when I'm trying to get the perfect one, right? And so I think we got to keep that in mind with some of this. And it can also still have the positive impact. I mean, first input delay started off really well. I think there's a very strong case that 100 milliseconds was always far too generous. But we have seen it trend up over time, so it has led to improvements, which is nice. And it's not just individual developers. We've actually seen the metrics and tooling can have the implications on a macro level as well. There's this nice little jump here that happened in 2021 in the number of origins that have a good first input delay. And what this comes from is actually a browser improvement. Stoyan is somewhere in here, Stoyan Stefanov. Hi. He ran into this actually. There's a double tap to zoom feature, right, on mobile devices. You tap, you zoom in. For Chrome to be able to make sure that something is a proper double tap versus some other click, they actually have to have a delay. They have to have, they say 300 milliseconds. In Stoyan's metrics, he was seeing something closer to 200, 250. But the delay is still there. It waits to see if that second click is coming, that second tap, so it knows to zoom in or fire it as a traditional event. They had already removed it in certain cases, but doing more experimentation, they discovered that they could actually be a little bit more aggressive about removing double tap to zoom. In this case, when they have minimum scale or maximum scale, something that was sort of implicitly specifying, that with device width or initial scale 1.0 or greater than equal to 1.0. So they did this. They turned off double tap to zoom, and the entire web benefits. We get like a good 3 to 4% jump on that first input delay. The biggest jump we'd seen or have seen the entire time. I mean, not too surprising, the fastest way to improve the web is to improve the platform itself. And we've seen plenty of that, by the way. There's ample evidence of this. In February, Google talked about the good INP increasing by 4% because they made an improvement to the Chrome scheduler. More recently, they started with the fetch priority. They started trying to increase image priority from low to medium for the first 5 images on a page. We're seeing wins coming to the browser. Baz talked about this with Firefox. We saw quite a bit of evidence of Firefox improving over the course of the year, some dramatic improvements. And he kind of called that out. This is like the advantages of benchmarks and metrics is that they have the opportunity to improve the entire web platform. So it's really exciting to see and hear examples of exactly that thing happening and happening in many different browsers, not just one. So I'm kind of excited about the INP switch. The other jump that I hope is coming is around memory usage. They say an elephant never forgets. It turns out a JavaScript-heavy page never forgets either. Memory is like a big black box right now. I think a few people dance around the topic. It comes up occasionally, usually in a side conversation, but that's kind of where it sits. I tried, when I was at Web Page Test, we ran a bunch of benchmarks to see like how much memory usage our site's using. And what we found was like it jumped up in the 90th percentile. They were using like 30 megs of memory usage, and this is just for JavaScript-related memory. This is not like the whole everything else that goes into images and stuff like that. I don't know what I was expecting. 30 to 40 megs feels heavy. I don't know if that's bad, though. Like, we're missing context, like, to some extent, right? Like, we're missing what are the upper bounds, like how much of the memory pool is actually available. It's hard to get good data around the constraints here. Also, the metrics for this are kind of lacking. This is based on a real user metric that was available, but to have it available and running because of, again, privacy and security issues, you have to have certain things that you're opted into. And last I checked Chrome usage, the things that you're opted into to be able to allow you to use this, it's less than like 5% of the web. It's a minuscule amount. So it's like we are at a tough situation to grab anything to help us correlate this to business metrics, user behavior, or to even understand like how much of a capacity are we actually using when it comes to this stuff. What I can say definitively is that memory leaks are everywhere. So first I want to show you a good one. So this is Sonos. How do you pronounce that one, the speakers? Sonos? Okay. So this is their site. This is actually a site on Next, but it is an MPA, as the kids are calling it these days. And so if you open up Chrome DevTools and say show performance monitor, I can never remember where to go, so I'm a Command-Shift-P, bring up the palette kind of guy. And bring up the performance monitor. You can track and watch the JavaScript heap size and a whole bunch of other stuff as you're kind of navigating through. So I went to a product listing page, started clicking on products, going back, just kind of like you would normally do that if you were shopping the site. And you'll see that we've got actually a pretty decent pattern here. The JavaScript heap size is going up, it's coming down. It's going up, it's coming back down. It stays at a pretty healthy number, close to where it started off. The browser is able to effectively clear things out when it's not needed. We're not retaining a bunch of memory. This is a good thing. This is a healthy little model here. For an unhealthy model, and I'll just tell you my approach for this was I went to Vercel and I just looked at their customers and popped up any site that was an SPA. Don't sue me, Vercel. But this is it turns out that pretty much every one of them has this problem. I'm sorry, this is the heap snapshot for that first one, just to show you. I also, you can take a heap snapshot in Chrome, which actually gives you the details of what is there. And you can see that even as I was going back and forth, we went from 33 to 35 to 37. It's all pretty close. There's not much change here in memory usage. This is Under Armour, which is a React-based SPA. Notice in this case, we do have a little bit, the heap size is going up. It is coming down a bit, but you'll notice that it's coming down higher than where it used to be, right? And as we continue to do this, we continue to do that same pattern, view some products, go back. It just continues to slowly climb like that with a few cleanses along the way, but the trajectory is up. If we take the heap snapshot to get a little bit more precise on what's going on, we went from 40 megs to 80 megs to 130 megs. Now, I was not doing anything crazy here. I was just looking at 2, 3 products, take a heap snapshot, take 2, 3 products, and then go back and take another heap snapshot. And I was tripling the memory usage. And now, if you look at what's here inside the other, where it's actually breaking everything down, you'll see a bunch of these detached things, right? Like detached internal node, detached SVG element, all of this stuff. Detached means that the browser wasn't able to clear this away. Somewhere there is a reference to this still in the code. Now it could be often it's with JavaScript you had an event listener that you didn't remove or something like that. But for whatever reason the browser can't quite get rid of this during garbage collection, and so it just kind of hangs around and it keeps building up and accumulating. Now, not to pick on just React, I'm an equal opportunity harasser. This is LinkedIn. Somebody actually pointed out to me that LinkedIn had an issue, so I fired that up. This is an Ember-based app. They don't ever come down. The trajectory just keeps going. It doesn't ever, you just keep doing this. I was on my profile page and just clicking through an activity and going backwards. Again, I think a normal user behavior, and balloon this to 450 megabytes in 4 clicks. There's a lot going on there. And again, just because I know Chrome has a little bit of the rep around like, memory sometimes, I don't know if it's a super justified or fair, but just to point it out, like you can get at these tools in other browsers and you see the same pattern. In Safari, if you're looking at the memory profile, it continues to go up. And if you look at Firefox, they actually have like a tree map visualization, which I kind of like, I think. I don't know. I will say that like this is the thing with memory tooling is I think getting from like, hey, we've spotted that there's an issue to figuring out what the issue is still challenging. Like you can get from the heap, for example, the constructors, you can get to the lines of code eventually, but you really have to parse the tree to figure out what the heck you're looking at and find the right line of code to get there. It's non-trivial, which is I think part of the reason too why we don't necessarily see a lot of innovation or work happening around memory optimization today. I'd say if we were looking at experimentation tooling metrics leading to new innovations and standards, when it comes to memory usage, we're really desperately still on this experimentation stage. The tooling is not where it needs to be. It's not usable enough. The metrics don't really exist for the most part. And therefore, we're not really going to see much in the way of new innovations and standards. I find it kind of interesting because it's a little bit of a chicken and the egg problem sometimes, right? Like, we need the demand to push for the features in the tools and for the new metrics, but the demand doesn't come unless people roll up their sleeves and start experimenting and trying to find a reason for it to be a problem in the first place. So we have a lot to learn here yet, but I'm optimistic we'll get there. And one thing that we do know is that it is tied to a lot of JavaScript usage, and that's particularly prevalent in the SPA area. I had a sad little laugh when this slide came up from Ryan, because it's a very common reality. And the truth is, the painful, uncomfortable truth is that single-page apps were never built to be performant. That was not the intent. I'm not naming names because I've said stuff. I've done all sorts of dumb stuff. I'm not throwing anybody under the bus here. What I will say is that there was somebody involved in the early forms of React who then gave a talk in 2015 and talking about the origins of React. And what they said, the exact quote talking about it, was that people started playing around with this internally and everyone had the same reaction. They were like, okay, I have no idea how this is going to be important or performant enough, but it's so fun to work with, right? Everybody's like, this is so cool. I don't really care if it's too slow. Someone's going to make it faster. It is a bad recipe for performance success. I just want to state that. That's not how you do that. That was never the goal with SPAs. It was always kind of from day one fighting an uphill battle there. But, there's a lot of developer ergonomics, a lot of different reasons. The adoption has been high. RUM Insights was a killer launch, by the way. Nice announcement on that one. I swapped this in there right away. One of the data points on the RUM Insights stuff that was pushed out earlier is multi-page versus SPA navigation. And you'll see that on mobile, it's about 35% of the navigations that they're reporting are single-page apps. So the adoption is pretty high. It's out there quite a bit, very prevalent. Now, the case for this, from a performance perspective, the argument for why SPAs might not be bad for perf is based on the fact that, okay, the initial boot of an SPA might be a bit slower, but our hope is that any subsequent navigations will be faster. So we will incur an upfront cost, but the hope is that it's amortized over the rest of the page views, and the composite experience is then a bit faster. I have my own beliefs on whether or not that's going to be true, but it's a really hard thing to prove right now, because even these metrics, this isn't like based on some browser thing that is reporting, right? This is Akamai data. So this is Impulse doing its own SPA determinations, which is great. It's great stuff. But like part of the reason why we have such a struggle with like proving the case of what to do with single page apps is because we don't have a way of measuring them consistently. There's no concept of a navigation. The browser doesn't know when an SPA navigation occurs because it doesn't look any different from anything else. Yoav and Barry, who are both here, and I encourage you talking to them instead of me, like they're much more interesting. But they wrote up about how they've been experimenting with measuring soft navigations, basically building in a soft navigation heuristic into the browser so that we can actually tell when those navigations occur. Now, this is non-trivial. Like this is like there's a lot of work to get that heuristic right. You got to look at like what's changing, how much of that's changing. All sorts of stuff goes into this. I don't get to work on it. I'm not smart enough to deal with that. It's intense stuff. But this is going to be a game changer, because when this comes out, we can actually start observing those soft navigations in a standardized way. We can start recording those navigations when they occur. We can start breaking down layout shifts in largest contentful paint by when they occur after the soft nav, because right now you get that LCP and it just kind of keeps kind of going, right? Because it's like the browser doesn't ever see you navigate away. The layout shifts are all accumulated to that first navigation. There's all sorts of issues with not just vitals, just any metric when it comes to an SPA. So having this heuristic land would be huge. Now, I suspect there's going to be some browser progression. I'm putting words into their mouth, but like I read the article. The article talks a little bit about like it gives examples of how you can reset LCP. I fully expect that at some point, if we can get more confident in that heuristic that the browser is going to start to do that for you, you're not going to have to be like, okay, I'm going to reset LCP. The browser will actually do some of that. In fact, that was implied in some of the early standards conversations. I suspect that's coming as well. But this is going to be a monumental shift. Like decades of debate about this is going to, well, I'm maybe naively optimistic, but hopefully be solved by a little bit more visibility in what's going on. So I'm excited because this wave of tooling, this wave of metrics is bringing visibility to issues that I think are all over the place, but we haven't quite gotten enough visibility to give them the attention that they deserve, or we haven't quite agreed how to solve them yet. But of course, the tooling and the metrics, and that's so very important, but like they don't happen in a vacuum. It all starts really with that curiosity. Curiosity is the spark. We've talked a bunch in all of these examples about the different experimentation that was necessary to, like the LCP examples are all over the place, but anything that we've done, you've heard this a few times now, how much that experimentation, how much the community plays a role in pushing these things forward. And so that brings me back to what is the single most important catalyst in the web performance industry, and that is you. That is us. That is the performance community. The future of performance has always been set and defined by community and by the community efforts. It's one of the great things about this little subsection of the industry. Community interest and experimentation is what led to innovations like new metrics, the new standards that we got out of that. The community feedback and innovation is what continues to push the refinement and adoption of modern metrics like INP with the potential to completely change the way we build for the web. It's why we're looking at the prospect of SPA navigation heuristics to potentially solve something that we've been debating for over a decade, bringing data to a debate that's long been lacking it. I loved this quote from her Q&A, from Katana's Q&A yesterday. They asked about React stuff, and she was like, if there's a better way to do it, we'll find out over the years, and we just keep getting better at it. Now, I'm a performance nut. I wouldn't mind saying that we'll find out over the minutes, but that's not reality. Like, progress is slow, progress is iterative. But I think this sums it up really, really nicely. I hope everyone here realizes the powerful role that they play in making this happen. If you work on browsers or you work on standards, hats off to you. That is such a thankless job, but what a massive impact. If you work on tooling, I hope you recognize the power you have to push the web forward. And I would hopefully encourage all of you and challenge you to not think so much to think past today's problems and think about how you could solve tomorrow's as well, because you can push that stuff forward in an incredible rate. And for everybody else who's here who doesn't do standards, doesn't do tooling, they just care about perf, they're working on it, I hope you realize that the importance and the influence that you have over this. I know Pat mentioned the origin trials and wanting feedback. Yoav gave a talk yesterday about wanting people to participate in performance standards groups and how to get involved in that. It's been a recurring theme. Nothing happens without the community pushing it forward. We can cultivate that curiosity and that spirit of experimentation, and that's how we make the web better. Thank you.